all our relationships in life, there are boundaries and there are expectations. A toddler may, in unknowing play, hit their parent too hard and it hurts. But it'll probably just be shrugged off. But should they stab their parent with scissors, it will not. A teen may kind of grumpily sulk out of the room without serious consequence, but should they take the baseball bat to the family car, there will be very serious consequences. And in a marriage, a husband may overspend slightly on a new tool and he will likely be forgiven. But should he disappear for 2 weeks without announcement, wasting his paycheck at the casino, he will have seriously undermined the trust of his marriage. But what about God? What does God expect as we relate to him and live before him? What would erode or destroy that relationship? In our passage today, we're going to see that these relational expectations and boundaries, it's similar to the situation of Israel, which was going to receive a promised land. Their future as God's people, their future of a thriving life before God depended on really God's expectations and how they live before him. Today we're going to be looking at Deuteronomy 12, and a little bit of backstory is actually important for our passage. God had created Adam and Eve in the garden of his presence. He blessed them and provided for their needs as he dwelled with them. But humans were not content to live under God's rule and instruction, and so they wanted their own understanding and moral framework, creating good and evil for themselves. And they rebelled and ate from the tree. And they received death and were driven out of the garden of God's presence. But God was gracious. He wouldn't leave things in that state, so he chose Abraham and his family to be the means by which he would restore his blessing and presence to the earth. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. Genesis 12:2. Well, fast forward a few hundred years and Abraham's family of blessing has become Israel, a large nation. And God is giving them a land where he promises to dwell with them, where he will bless them. And what are the expectations that God has of his people as Israel enters the land? What are the critical pieces that will preserve Israel's relationship, their life of blessing under God, or destroy it? Within that context, we can read our passage today, Deuteronomy 12, verses 1 to 14. If you're able, please stand with me as I read God's word. Be careful to follow these statutes and ordinances in the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you to possess all the days you live on it, on the earth. Destroy completely all the places where the nations that you are driving out worship their gods. On the high mountains, on the hills, and under every green tree. Tear down their altars, smash their sacred pillars, burn their Asherah poles, cut down the carved images of their gods, and wipe out their names from every place. Don't worship the Lord your God this way. Instead, turn to the place the Lord your God chooses from all your tribes to put his name for his dwelling, and go there. You are to bring there your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your tenths and personal contributions, your vow of offerings and free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks. You will eat there in the presence of the Lord your God, and rejoice with your household in everything you do, because the Lord your God has blessed you. You are not to do as we are doing here today. Everyone is doing what seems right in his own sight. Indeed, you have not yet come into the resting place and the inheritance the Lord your God is giving you. When you cross the Jordan and live in the land the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and he gives you rest from all the enemies around you, and you live in security, then the Lord your God will choose the place to have his name dwell. Bring there everything I command you, your burnt offerings, sacrifices, offerings of the tenth, personal contributions, and all your choice offerings you vow to the Lord. You will rejoice before the Lord your God. You, your sons and daughters, your male and female slaves, and the Levites who is within your city gates, since he has no portion or inheritance among you. Be careful not to offer your burnt offerings in all the sacred places you see. You must offer your burnt offerings only in the place the Lord your God chooses in one of your tribes, and there you must do everything I command you. Be seated. Our passage today has the following thrust: destroy false worship and delight in the Lord in the way that he designs. Destroy false worship and delight in the Lord in the way that he designs. And we're going to walk through 4 points today together. The destruction of idols, the design of worship, the denial of God, and delight in the Lamb. Let's begin with verses 1 to 4 of our passage, the destruction of idols. Our passage actually begins a much larger section in Deuteronomy from chapters 12 to 36 on God's laws. And we see verse 1 of our passage is kind of a heading of that. And verse 2 begins to fill out the content of what that looks like. Israel should destroy every place where the nations are currently worshiping. Israel was called not only to drive out the inhabitants who had polluted the land with child sacrifice and temple prostitution, but to clear the land from false worship. And the destruction of these places is to be complete. At the end of verse 2, we see that any kind of place where worship happened was to be destroyed. Verse 3, we see that any kind of religious idols that existed were to be destroyed. It wasn't just kind of re-landscape the area or paint over an idol, it was destruction. And at the end of verse 3, we really see the heart of it. It says, you shall destroy or wipe out their names from this place. The calling of a place by the name of a god was common in the Old Testament. It was a way of ascribing ownership. Just like being called by the name of the Lord in the Old Testament showed that a person belonged to the Lord, so here the message is that the claims and the memories of the idols should be completely erased. And not to do so would be a compromise of allegiance. It's like a Leafs fan buying a car from Quebec and not scrubbing off the huge Montreal Canadiens bumper sticker. Well, what's the point? Verse 5 tells us, if Israel was to truly belong to the Lord, to Yahweh, their God, he demanded worship in a totally different way. He wasn't just another god to be worshipped at the local shrine, however people wanted, where people sought to placate the gods and just ensure their security, success, and significance. No. As we'll see, God alone was to be the source of Israel's security, success, and significance. There was to be no compromise in any way. And the call to be rid of idols still challenges us. For we are tempted by modern gods to seek success, security, and satisfaction in a variety of modern stories or methods. So what might we need to destroy? Have you been seeking satisfaction in shopping and you actually just need to give your spouse your credit card? Or regularly share your credit card statement with a friend so that you are accountable and transparent with someone? Or maybe you've been seeking success in your work at the cost of all else, at the cost of your family, your church, and of God himself. Maybe you need to switch jobs to have more time and live on less. Or maybe you have been putting your security in your growing investments rather than the Lord. You have struggled to give regularly or to the church or be generous in any way because you have not been trusting God for your security. Maybe you have a codependent relationship where you look to another person to ultimately give you meaning rather than God. Well, let me encourage you to take radical action against the idols that tempt your heart. Is there something that we are looking to that we hope will give us success, security, or significance? Ask someone close to you. Ask them what they think tempts you. All of us together as the people of God need to destroy our idols. But if the idols are destroyed, well, what does that have to say positively about worship? That leads to our second point, the design of worship. There's a very simple assumption as we look all through verses 5 and 14, and that is this: because God is God, it is his commands rather than our desires and preferences that dictate how we worship. Just as a man cannot truly love his wife by buying her power tools and snow tires for Christmas, so we are not free to worship God in any old way that pleases us and expect God to accept it. We worship on God's terms, not on ours. This is really actually an extension of the first commandment, have no gods before him. Or in other words, God's greatness determines what is worthy of his worship. Whether it be the songs we sing or the worship of our lives, it should all be worthy of him. And there's a key phrase in this passage. It's an Old Testament passage. And so it comes from a different time in the story of God's redemption than us. And that key phrase is in verse 5. It says there, instead, turn to the place the Lord your God chooses from all your tribes to put his name for his dwelling. God had a plan to centralize worship in Israel around one place. This hadn't happened in a clear way since Israel had come out of Egypt, and so everyone, to greater and lesser degrees, was still doing as they saw fit. Verse 8 actually says this. Everybody's kind of doing what's right in their own eyes. Yes, Israel had the tabernacle for sacrifice, but God had a greater plan to actually protect the worship of himself. He had a plan to put his name among his people so that, like Adam in the garden before the fall, God had a desire to impress his name on his people so that all of their life might reflect him. By centralizing worship, God wanted himself to be at the center of his people's lives and thoughts and affections. But this isn't the kind of heavy-handed suppression resulting in mindless submission that what we might call worship. No, it's actually for our joy. This appears a few times in the passage. Verse 7 says this, you will eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice with your household in everything you do because the Lord your God has blessed you. After listing the various gifts that should be brought in sacrifices, it says that God's people were to rejoice before the Lord. And verse 12 echoes this call to rejoice before the Lord. And actually, this call appears repeatedly all over Deuteronomy when it talks about worshiping in one place. The call to worship according to what God says, God's designs, is a call to joy. Rather than being lost in the lies of our own idolatry and self-deception, God leads us to a true knowledge of himself for our joy. I remember once, while we were serving and living in Zambia, we went to a very remote village that took a whole day of hiking through the mountains. And it was a very long walk, and you drank your water up very quickly along this walk. And then there was nothing to drink. Nothing until you got to this cool and clean mountain stream. After hiking for hours, you come around the bend, and there is only one thing that you want. Imagine you come around the bend, and there is the perfect steak. Well, I don't want it, actually. Or maybe a slice of rich chocolate cake. No good. Or even ice cream. Still not really what I need. Only the water satisfies. And God has structured worship, commanded worship, in a way that we get him what our souls really need. And this is meant for everybody. It talks in verse 12 how there's a whole list of positions in the ancient household, the ancient family, and everybody is meant to be a part of it. God's people worshiping God, delighting in him in the way that he designs. And in terms of designs, there's two details that are worth noting in this passage. First of all, the offerings that they make were actually from God. God had blessed them with these things. They hadn't earned them. At the end of verse 7, it says, because the Lord your God has blessed you. The sacrifices, the gifts that they brought were actually things God had previously blessed them with. Their worship was a response, an outflow of God's prior grace and generosity toward them. And the final point I want to make about God's design for worship actually comes from later in the chapter, not directly in our passage, but connected with it. And that's in verses 23 and 24 of our passage. It says this, but don't eat the blood, since the blood is the life, and you must not eat the life with the meat. Do not eat blood, pour it on the ground like water. An important and central reason for God's commands about one central place of worship was actually to preserve the nature of blood sacrifice. Israel was allowed to slaughter animals for meat, wherever they lived. That wasn't a big deal. But they could not eat blood, as the rest of the chapter, if you were to read it, talks about. Why? Because the blood symbolized the ending of the life of the animal. The blood was a symbol of the life, as we saw in verse 23. And this blood was for pouring out on the altar. So what's the logic here? I'm just going to flip over to Leviticus 17:11, and it fills out the logic. It says this, for the life of a creature is in the blood, and I have appointed it to you, this is God speaking, to make atonement on the altar for your lives, since it is the lifeblood that makes atonement. The blood, which was the life of the animal, had been given by God to Israel so that they might make atonement for their sins, so that they might be forgiven. In seeking to preserve right worship of himself for the joy of Israel, God does not want his people to be confused about how sin is forgiven. For God's glory and our good, In the chaos and traditions of idolatry of the nations that surrounded them, that sought to appease gods in a variety of ways, God wanted Israel to know that atonement, that forgiveness of sins was a gift that he had given them. But how did Israel actually do at this? At fulfilling God's design for worship? Did they keep their joy by keeping their God and his words? Well, that leads us to a third point, the denial of God. This journey to one central place of worship actually has a time marker on it. You may have noticed it in verse 10. It clarifies that Israel will enter, dwell in, and possess the land. Not only this, God will give them peace or rest from their enemies. Just like God had settled Adam in the garden in peace, Sabbath rest, so in his sovereign power as king, God would settle Israel. And when that happened, they should worship at the place of God's choosing. But did this process of protecting joy by clarified worship happen in Israel? Well, in bits and pieces, kind of. You might remember certain episodes from Israel's history. Hannah went up to worship at Shiloh before the Lord at the one place where he had said his name. But then a few chapters later, the ark is stolen and the whole thing's destroyed. Solomon, the man of peace, that's what his name means, builds the temple during a time of peace for the Lord's name. But Solomon himself continues to worship at the high places that this passage forbids. Not long before the exile, Jeremiah says that God will judge Israel and her temple. Let me read those words. Jeremiah chapter 7, verses 12 to 15. It says this: "But return to my place that was at Shiloh," that's where God had dwelled, "where I had made my name dwell at first. See what I did to it because of the evil of my people Israel. Now because you have done all these things," this is the Lord's declaration, "and because I have spoken to you time and time again, but you wouldn't listen, and I have called to you, but you wouldn't answer, what I did to Shiloh I will do to the house that bears my name, the house in which you trust, and the place that I gave you and your ancestors." Israel's religious history is one of failure. It often started off by worshiping the right God, but in the wrong way, not in the way he designed. It wasn't worthy of him. Their hearts were elsewhere. They were using the traditions of other nations, and they slowly backed away from God. And at some point for Israel, worshiping the true God in a false way became worshiping a false God. And so we should ask ourselves, who or what am I worshiping? What is my delight really in? Am I worshiping according to God's words, or am I kind of sprinkling in some of my own, and whether that's some sort of church rules or tradition, or whether that's just the latest YouTube short I've seen, or the kind of creeping Eastern spirituality that pervades our society? God is summoning us to listen to himself about worship. Several years ago, we used to live near the Black Sea. And every Christmas we would go down to the Black Sea as a family. And this year we went down, and to get to where we used to go, you had to go down this little farm lane, and it was around Christmas, and it was all blown in by snow. And so I started down the lane, and I hear from the back seat, "Daddy, I think you should stop." And I'm like, "Hun, I know what I'm doing." And so I keep going. "Dad, I think we're going to get stuck." And I'm like, "Hun, it's a four-wheel drive vehicle. It'll be fine." And I keep going, and we're probably 200 meters down the lane now. And it's like, "Dad, I really think we're going to get stuck. Dad, you need to stop. You need to stop. You need to stop." And, "Honey, it's fine." And lo and behold, I turn off the car and we're stuck. I just didn't want to listen to my 8-year-old daughter. And in a similar way, God can repeatedly summon us from the foolishness that we have, and we just don't want to listen. Am I listening to God's words about worship? And that leads us to our final point, really. Delight in the Lamb. Just as the sacrifices of atonement for forgiveness of sin were actually a gift from God to an unworthy Israel, so now in Jesus Christ, God has provided forgiveness for a sinful humanity. And to close this morning, I want to flip over to 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 13 to 21. In 1 Peter, what we see is that God has brought to a climax this principle. Destroy false worship and delight in the Lord in the way that he designs. I'm going to read 1 Peter 1, verses 13 to 21. Therefore, with your minds ready for action, be sober-minded and set your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the desires of your former ignorance, but as the one who called you is holy, you also are to be holy in all your conduct. For it is written, be holy because I am holy. If you appeal to the Father who judges impartially according to one's work, you are to conduct yourselves as reverence during your time living as strangers. For you know that you were redeemed from your empty way of life, inherited from your ancestors, not with perishable things like silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of an unblemished and spotless lamb. He was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for you. Through him you believe in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. First, we notice two things, which are flip sides of the same coin. One is a call that our hope would be in God. That all of our faith and hope would be in God. Verse 21. Of course, God uses many means to care for us, to provide for us, to give us significance, actually, in our lives. But he wants our hope to be in none of them. Our hope is in the Lord. Here's the other side. Do not be conformed to this age and its desires. Just as Israel wasn't to be conformed to the myriad of gods around them that the other nations were worshiping. Verse 16 says we're supposed to be set apart, holy in our conduct. We have been redeemed from the foolish conduct of our culture. Verse 18. God is building a church, each one of us a living stone, into a spiritual dwelling for himself. He doesn't just put his name among us. He has given us his spirit. In a culture that is so easy to get disoriented, in a world of multiculturalism that claims 1,000 spiritualities and that they're all legitimate, it is so easy to make some cultural narrative or some political narrative dominant narrative of our lives rather than what God has said to us. God has called us to be set apart for himself and put all of our hope in himself. Why? Because of the death of Jesus Christ. That's why we should be set apart for him. The spotless lamb. His blood, his death was the redemption price. We are freed from slavery and belong to God. Jesus died our death so that we might have forgiveness. But even more than this, if you look at verse 19, it says that this was foreknown, that it was planned before God made the world. God had intentionally structured history around the death of his son for sinners, so that you and I might belong to him, and so that all of our hope might be in him. Deuteronomy 12, the passage we looked at earlier this morning, and this preservation of joy in God through pure sacrifice, well, that was really just one step along the way to preserving clarity about what God would do in the death of Jesus Christ to save sinners. This inexpressible and glorious joy, salvation of our souls. One God, the only hope of every human that has ever lived, and Jesus Christ, the only Savior for every human ever born. This is actually the heart of Christian mission. God has revealed his eternal plan for right worship, and it is through the cross of Jesus Christ, the cross of his Son. And so we summon all the world, and we ourselves are summoned to forsake doing what is right in our own eyes, in our own culture's eyes, and to come and find joy in and before the Lord Jesus Christ. For a whole world that has been wandering in its own foolish traditions, Jesus Christ mercifully gives his life as a ransom. And that's always been the plan for all eternity. But it's made known in these last days for those who would believe, for the church, so that we would renounce any hope for today or for tomorrow, in life and in death, but God who has raised Jesus Christ from the dead. Come and let us put our faith in him.